They say silence is peaceful. But I learned that silence can also be the loudest sound in the world. The sound of everything you love disappearing in one single moment. One phone call, one weak voice on the other end, one sentence that tore the ground from under my feet. And suddenly, I was no longer a wife. I was a widow. People think grief is loud, tears, screams, collapsing to the floor. But real grief is quiet. It lives in the corners of the room where he used to sit. It breathes through the empty chair at the dining table. It follows you in the stillness of dawn, shadows where his voice used to be. That morning, I woke up as a wife. By nightfall, I was a stranger to my own life. I did not hold his hand in the final breath. I did not whisper one more prayer into his ear. I was not there to tell him I loved him for the last time, because death does not wait for loved ones to arrive. It just takes, and then it leaves you behind, to learn how to live with the echo. Before that call, I lived in a world built from partnership, not perfection, but togetherness. My husband was not just the man I shared a home with. He was the voice of steadiness in my storms, the weight of reassurance in my doubts, the quiet laugh filling the room when I pretended to be angry at him. Loving him was the simplest part of my life. Losing him became the hardest. He left for a short trip that day, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. He had seemed a little tired, but I brushed it off as routine exhaustion. He had always worked more than he should, cared for more people than himself, worried about everyone except his own body. I had asked him to rest, but he smiled the way he always did, that comforting smile that told me everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Didn't know that smile was goodbye. The house was quiet when the call came. There was no warning, no sign, just a sudden stillness in the air, as if life itself paused before shattering. I remember my fingers trembling so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I remember the hollow tone of the doctor's voice, gentle, practiced, distant. I remember shaking my head even though he couldn't see me, whispering, "No, you must be mistaken," like a broken prayer. But death never negotiates. I remember my breath leaving my body, as if a part of me followed him out of this world. I remember reaching for the nearest wall just to stay standing. The world did not collapse with thunder. It collapsed quietly, like a candle fading in an empty room. And yet, in that moment of shattering, the world kept moving around me. People spoke, phones rang, doors opened and closed. Life continued, stubborn and unaware, while mine had already stopped. The days that followed were a blur, a fog I walked through without really seeing anything. People came to offer condolences, but I don't remember their words. Faces moved in front of me like passing shadows. I don't even remember who hugged me first, only that I felt nothing. Grief had wrapped me in a cocoon of numbness, sparing me from drowning all at once. My son looked tense, not broken, not shattered, just uneasy. And my daughter, she did what every good daughter-in-law is expected to do in front of others. She held my hand, brought me water, pressed her face close with a performance of sorrow. But her eyes were dry. And to calm at the time, I told myself I was imagining it. I thought grief was twisting my perception. I chose not to believe what I had already sensed. A quiet distance behind her softness, because I was still clinging to the hope that family meant anchor, not drift. After the funeral, the house changed, not in furniture or walls, but in spirit. His shoes near the doorway felt heavier than all the people in the room. His empty teacup on the side table looked like a wound open in daylight. I found myself sitting in his chair at night, just to feel close to something that still carried his warmth. I prayed, not loudly, not desperately, but softly, asking God for strength, for breath, for courage not to crumble. My son told me to rest more, but there was something strange in the way he said it, as if he was already creating a boundary between my grief and his convenience. He visited less in those first weeks than I expected. My daughter-in-law insisted she was handling everything, but I slowly realized everything didn't include me. It included decisions, arrangements, conversations I wasn't being included in. They whispered more than they spoke. Doors closed faster. Phone calls ended when I walked into the room. I excused it all as stress. After all, we had all lost him. Everyone grieves differently, right? That's what I told myself, because the alternative was too painful to accept. But grief teaches you to hear the quiet things. You start noticing what people don't say, what they hide in the pauses, what they tuck into lowered eyes and half-hearted embraces. I didn't know it yet, but the real storm had not begun. This was only the stillness before it, and I, a wife still learning how to be a widow, had no idea that I was about to lose something far more cruel than a husband. I was about to lose the illusion that I was loved. The first weeks after his death passed like slow-moving shadows. I woke up every morning expecting to hear his footsteps, expecting him to call my name from the hallway, expecting the sound of him searching for his glasses like he had done every morning for years, and every day I had to learn again, painfully, that those small sounds were gone forever. I kept his side of the bed untouched. I couldn't fold his last shirt back into the wardrobe. I found myself inhaling the faint trace of his cologne on the collar, not because I wanted to cry, but because I wanted to remember what home once smelled like. I spoke less, prayed more, and carried grief in silence the way widows are expected to. People offered sympathy, but sympathy ends quickly for everyone except the one who remains behind. That my daughter began staying busy with paperwork. She claimed she was helping my son organize things, but what I didn't realize then was that they were not organizing grief. They were organizing absence, slowly, quietly, methodically. They were reshaping the house, as if preparing for a version of life where I would not be needed. They did not remove me. They simply started making space around me, as though I were a piece of furniture waiting to be moved. Meals became rushed, conversations became small, and I began to notice how my presence made them exchange glances, not concerned glances, measured ones. I still tried to justify it. I told myself, they're young, they're overwhelmed, they're trying to handle responsibility, but a part of me, a very quiet part, already understood something was shifting. Beneath the surface, loneliness feels different when it lives inside a house full of people. It is colder, sharper. It reminds you that a person can sit beside you and still not see you. Sometimes at night, I would sit in the small courtyard alone, whispering prayer, not because I was asking for miracles, but because I needed to feel that God still saw me when no one else did. I held on to faith like a thread, thin but unbroken. I asked for strength, not justice. At that time, I didn't know justice would later become the only thing left for me to fight for. There was one evening I remember clearly. The first time I sensed a wall I could not name. I walked into the living room, unexpectedly, and they both fell silent. Not the silence of sorrow, the silence of interruption, a silence that hides something. When I asked gently if I had disturbed anything, they smiled too quickly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I brushed it aside. I told myself grief makes the mind suspicious. I told myself no child would ever push away his own mother, especially not when she had just lost everything. I didn't know that betrayal doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps in like a slow leak, silent, unnoticed, until the foundation is already rotting. Weeks passed, and the house stopped feeling like mine. My husband had built everything we owned with a life of discipline and sacrifice. He had always said, "Whatever I have is for you first. You have walked every hardship with me." I used to laugh at him when he said that. I never imagined one day I would need those words like armor. I thought my son understood his father's values. I thought his wife would stand with me as family, not as a spectator. I thought affection meant belonging. But grief has a cruel way of testing bonds, not by breaking them, but by revealing which ones were hollow from the start. One morning, I overheard my daughter-in-law talking to someone on the phone. She didn't know I was standing behind the door. Her voice was sweet, too sweet, the polished voice people use when they are pretending to care. She said, "Yes, yes. Soon, everything will be finalized. Then she won't have to worry about anything." She, not Mama, not Amy, not Mother. She, just one word, and the world inside that word told me she was not speaking for me. She was speaking about me. I stood frozen in the hallway, trying to tell myself I had misunderstood. But grief sharpens instinct. It teaches you to hear meaning, even when people don't say it aloud. That night, I sat alone in my room, pressing his photograph to my chest. I whispered into the silence, "If you can hear me, if you are near me, I don't know how to walk this road alone." I wasn't asking for rescue. I was asking not to feel abandoned. But God does not answer immediately. Sometimes He allows darkness first, so when light returns, you recognize it. I believed the worst had already happened, his death. I didn't know the real heartbreak was waiting in front of me. Not the grief of losing a husband, but the grief of realizing I was about to lose the home he left me to protect. I still didn't know what they were planning. I didn't know what was being signed behind closed doors. I didn't know what conversations were happening in hushed tones while I cried alone in my room. I didn't know, but I was about to. Because betrayal, real betrayal, does not reveal itself in anger or shouting. It reveals itself in silence. In a moment when you suddenly understand, you were never part of their future, you were only part of their past. And that revelation was only one conversation away, before grief ever touched my doorstep. I lived in a world where love was something I never doubted. My husband was the kind of man whose presence was enough to silence every fear before it could grow. I didn't need to fight for space in my own home, because his respect had already built it for me. I belonged here not by convenience, but by effort, loyalty, and years of partnership. When he walked beside me, I never once imagined I could become invisible in the very house I helped build from emptiness into comfort. But invisibility doesn't arrive like a storm. It doesn't shout. It slips in quietly like cold air through a half-opened window, so gentle that by the time you feel the chill, it is already inside you. My son had his own world long before things went wrong. Work, friends, distractions. I told myself it was normal. Sons drift but they return, I believed. He was not cruel, not careless, just distant in a way that made me miss a version of him that still looked at me with boyish certainty. After marriage, the distance wasn't shocking, it was believable, so I didn't question it. I told myself this is what happens when a man builds a life with another woman. You don't lose him, you just share him. And I was willing to share, because mothers do not measure love in percentages, but she did. She never shouted, never raised her tone, never set herself in open opposition. The danger in her was wrapped in softness, a sweetness that did not comfort, but camouflaged something colder. She studied the house before she touched it. She studied the people before she steered them. And she studied me most of all, not to learn from me, but to replace the very space I occupied. In the beginning I was almost grateful. She would sit beside me, hand me tea, fold my scarf neatly on the chair, speak politely, and call me Amy with practiced warmth. I thought it was care. I thought it was respect. But it wasn't respect, it was access. She wasn't trying to enter my heart. She was trying to enter my position. The first time I sensed something was shifting, I dismissed it, because mothers cling to hope the way drowning men cling to floating wood. It was a small moment, a night when my husband had a mild fever and I went to get warm water for him. When I returned, she was already sitting beside him, gently patting his arm and telling me if I could rest, she would stay with him. There was no insult in her tone, but there was an ownership I had never seen before, not the ownership of responsibility, but of territory. And my son, he didn't say, "No, Amy will stay." He didn't even look at me. He just let her answer for him. Something inside me tightened that night. A kind of warning the heart understands long before the mind does. I didn't act on it. I simply absorbed it, the way women do when the pain is not sharp enough to bleed, but deep enough to settle. Then the pattern continued. Small exclusions, disguised as thoughtfulness. She didn't correct me. She replaced me. She didn't compete with me. She circled around me until I was standing outside of a role I once lived inside. She began serving his meals before I could reach the table. She began answering questions directed to him as though she was his voice. She began silently taking over routines that had once been mine. Every shift was gentle, but every gentle shift moved me further from the center of my own life. I told myself I was imagining it. Women are trained to doubt their instincts long before they doubt others, but love cannot blind forever. Eventually something forces you to see. For me, it was a dinner conversation. My husband asked my son if he knew where all the documents were kept, bank records, property papers, legacy matters. Before my son could speak, she spoke calmly, confidently. "Of course, Baba, I know everything." There was no hesitation, no modesty, no space offered to me. It was the tone of someone who already believed the house would go through her, not through us. And my son, my child, smiled as if this was natural. It wasn't love I saw that day. It was possession masquerading as dedication. It is a terrible thing to feel the weight of being slowly replaced, while still existing inside your own home. To feel people moving around you while you stand still in a life you once anchored. I didn't lose my son overnight. I was slowly peeled away from him. I didn't lose my place. I was quietly escorted out of it. She didn't remove me. She made me redundant. And redundancy is the most elegant form of erasure. I started to realize that I was no longer the first person he looked toward when something mattered. He didn't ask for my opinion, not because he didn't respect me, but because someone else had already stepped into the space where my voice used to be heard. My presence became ceremonial, a formality, something beautiful to show, but no longer essential to function. That is when a silent question began forming in the corners of my heart. If one day I disappeared, would anyone notice the absence, or would they simply adjust? There were nights I would lie awake next to my husband, listening to his breathing in the dark, and a strange kind of fear would wrap itself around me. A fear I did not recognize yet, because it had no name. I wasn't afraid of losing him to death. I was afraid of losing my place in life if he was no longer here to witness it. A woman can survive heartbreak, loneliness, even age, but there is a certain kind of erasure that begins the moment there is no longer anyone to say she mattered. I didn't know that was what I was sensing. I only knew that something sacred was loosening around me. I began noticing how my daughter-in-law positioned herself, not beside me, but between me and everything that once routed me. If my husband called for me, she would answer first. If family visited, she would speak over me with polite enthusiasm, ensuring she was the voice they heard. She wasn't loud, but she was present in a way that left me slightly dimmed. When people visited, they saw her efficiency before they saw my history. They saw her active presence before they saw my earned place. And the worst part was, she did it under the guise of devotion, so that questioning her would make me look ungrateful. I still remember the way my son started using the word we, not Amy and I, not our family, but we, meaning him and his wife, as though the unit that once included me had been updated, revised, and I was only there as leftover tradition, not as foundation. He didn't know what he was doing. That's the tragedy of it. He wasn't malicious. He was absent. The cruelty was not intentional. It was convenient. A son who doesn't think is sometimes more dangerous than a son who openly rebels. At least rebellion tells you what you are fighting. Silence gives you nothing to hold on to. There are wounds that are not created with words or fights, but with gradual replacement, the steady quiet of being outgrown without being thanked, forgotten without being rejected, replaced without being mourned. And I was living that slow subtraction every day. On good days, I blamed time. On bad days, I blamed myself. And on nights when I could not sleep, I blamed destiny for giving me love that came with an expiry I had not prepared for. The real shift happened the day I saw her instructing household staff in front of my husband, not asking, instructing, not consulting, directing, and the staff obeyed, looking toward her as though she were already the decision maker. I caught my reflection in the window glass that day, and I did not recognize the woman I saw. I looked present, but not central, existing, but no longer secure. It was the expression of someone whose value was dissolving into the background. A home does not become a battlefield when someone screams. It becomes one when someone quietly moves you out of sight while still pretending to hold your hand. My husband still loved me, but he was beginning to lean on her help more than mine. Age makes a man depend on the hands closest to him, and she made sure those hands were always hers. He didn't understand the shift because his heart was simple. He believed family was unity. I was the one who could see that unity, in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon. Sometimes I wanted to tell him what I was feeling, but I stopped every time. I told myself I was overthinking, that she was just eager to contribute, that this was how modern women behaved, forward, efficient, involved. And yet, deep inside, a quiet knowing was forming. She wasn't involving herself to support the family. She was positioning herself to inherit it. That thought terrified me, not because of money, but because of what it implied, that there was something she wanted from this house that required me to be slowly pushed aside first. I still remember a small but telling moment. My husband was going through some documents, reading glasses perched on his nose, concentration deep. I walked over to hand him a pen, and before I could place it in his hand, she reached from the other side and gave him one first. It was a second, a tiny moment, but it was symbolic. She had moved just fast enough to appear necessary, just gentle enough to appear loving, just confident enough to appear rightful. I froze there, hands still holding the pen, suddenly unsure whether I was still needed in a life I once helped build from nothing. There is a loneliness that starts long before widowhood, a loneliness that begins the day a woman realizes she can still be surrounded by people and still not be seen. My husband was breathing beside me, my son was under the same roof, yet I was already alone, not because they stopped loving me, but because someone else had already begun guiding their love away from me and toward herself. I wish I could say I was strong enough to confront it early, but the truth is I was still hopeful then. I believed life would correct itself. I believed love would remember its way back. I believed time would soften what felt like distance. But time was not softening anything. It was preparing me for a storm I didn't know was coming. The feeling had already begun growing quietly in my chest. The feeling that if anything happened to my husband, this house would not see me. It would tolerate me. I didn't know I was living my last season of being protected. I didn't know I was walking beside the last person who still held me as irreplaceable. I didn't know the ground beneath me was already loosening, waiting for the day when I would stand without him and finally realize how far I had already been pushed without noticing. I didn't know I was about to lose more than a husband. I was about to lose my witness. And once a woman loses the one person who remembers her worth, the world begins negotiating it. I began waking up earlier than usual in those days. I don't know if it was intuition, fear, or a woman's silent instinct that knows when life is about to change forever. The mornings felt heavier, and the quiet in our home didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a warning. He had started getting tired more quickly, rubbing his chest whenever he thought I wasn't looking. But whenever I asked, he would brush it off with a half smile, saying, "I'm fine. You worry too much." But his voice no longer carried strength. It carried avoidance. I would pretend to believe him, and he would pretend he was still unshakable. That was our secret dance in those final days, love trying to hide its fear. He had stopped walking in the garden that week, and I found him sitting more than usual, still staring at his documents, as though some conversation was unfinished in his mind. At night, I would find him awake, breathing heavily but speaking softly, saying things like everything must stay in harmony and you must be protected. As if his soul knew what his body refused to confess. I tried to lighten his mood, to sit beside him as I always did, but there was a distance, not emotional, but spiritual, the kind that happens when one person is already halfway to goodbye. The daughter-in-law had grown strangely calm, too calm. Her voice had become sugary, and she had started lingering around him more often, not with concern, but with calculation. I saw the way her eyes stayed not on his face but on his briefcase, the safe key on his dresser, the locked drawer in his study. She wasn't waiting for him to get well, she was waiting for him to leave a vacancy. And her husband, my son, had begun orbiting around her more than his father. I wasn't blind, I just prayed I was wrong. That afternoon, the house felt unsettled, again like a storm hiding behind a curtain of silence. I served him lunch myself, even though the daughter-in-law tried to interrupt, offering to take care of him. He looked relieved when I insisted. We sat together the way we always had, passing small jokes and half-finished stories between us, but his hand trembled faintly when he lifted the spoon. His eyes dimmed for a moment, as if the world was slipping slightly out of focus. I wanted to call the doctor again, but I waited. I shouldn't have waited. After lunch, he said he wanted to sit in the lounge near the window, in his favorite chair where sunlight touched his face. I made him tea, not because he asked, but because I wanted to feel useful in the moments where I felt everything else slipping away. When I returned, I found him leaning back with his hand pressed to his chest again. I put the tray down quickly and reached for him, but he forced a small smile through the heaviness on his features and whispered, "I'm just tired, sit with me." And I did. I sat there pretending nothing was wrong, because I didn't want him to see the panic rising inside me like a scream I couldn't release. He closed his eyes for a moment, not sleeping, just breathing slowly through discomfort. And that is when I saw it again, the daughter-in-law standing halfway down the hallway, watching him like she was waiting for a verdict. Not of sickness, of timing. She wasn't worried. She was anticipating. When she noticed I saw her, she quickly rearranged her expression into artificial concern. But her eyes, they were already counting something that wasn't hers yet. I stayed with him the rest of that afternoon. His breathing grew slower, but he kept talking to me in little fragments, reminding me where the important documents were, telling me which people he trusted, asking if I still remembered the old lawyer who had been with him for 30 years. His voice shook when he said, "Some things must never be touched by the wrong hands." I didn't realize then that he was preparing me, not warning me. I kept brushing his hair back gently, pretending I still had time to keep him, hold him, protect him, pretending love could bargain with fate. When evening drew closer, the house got quieter, almost unnaturally so. My son hadn't checked on him even once. She didn't either, not unless she thought she could gain something from being seen near him. The silence of those walls still rings in my chest when I think about it. Love was present in that room between me and my husband, but outside those doors, appetite was waiting. He tried to stand, just to move to the other chair, but his foot slipped very slightly, and his body leaned too heavily into mine. That was the first moment I truly panicked. I begged him to sit down again. He laughed quietly, not to dismiss me, just to stop me from breaking. Then he squeezed my hand, the way he used to when something frightened me, and he wanted to anchor me to calmness. Except this time, his hand was cold, and fear wasn't visiting MIT, was settling in. I told him I should call the doctor. He didn't argue. He didn't tell me I was overreacting this time. He just nodded slowly. That was the moment I knew whatever was inside his chest wasn't leaving. I stepped away, just for a moment, just one moment, to get my phone from the other room. And in that small, fatal stretch of time, the world I had lived in for my entire marriage began collapsing behind me. When I came back into the room, I found him leaning forward, one hand gripping the arm of the chair, as though the weight of his own heartbeat had turned against him. The color had drained from his face. His breaths were shallow, uneven, like each one had to fight its way through him. I rushed to him, calling his name, but his body no longer responded with steadiness, only tremors. I knelt beside him, holding his hand, begging him to look at me, to stay with me, to not leave me sitting there alone, in a room that suddenly felt too big and too cold. Breathe, just breathe, I whispered, my voice shaking as if prayer itself had begun to tremble through me. His head tilted back slightly, his eyelids fluttering like wind-struck curtains. I could hear myself calling for help, but my voice came out broken, like I was shouting underwater. No one came, not a single footstep moved toward him. The house was full, but I was alone. He clutched his chest harder, pain drowning out the world in his eyes, and I held his face in both hands, my tears spilling before I even knew I was crying. I'm here, just hold on. He looked at me, not in fear, not even in pain, just in a deep, aching resignation, as if he already knew the door he was standing at, and all that was left was to cross it. The doctor wasn't there yet, my son wasn't there. The people who should have been running toward him were the ones listening from a distance, waiting for life to finish what greed had already begun planning for. I kept gripping his arm, feeling the slow weakening of his strength through my fingertips, like love itself was slipping out of my hands. Then something inside him gave way. His breath staggered, his entire body tensed for a moment and then began to fold inward. Panic seized me so violently, I could hardly feel the floor beneath me. No, stay here, look at me, just breathe please. My voice was no longer steady. I could hear myself begging like a child who had just seen the world break. For a second, he tried to speak. His lips moved, but no sound came. Only his eyes, the eyes that had always been my shelter, my certainty, my belonging. He looked at me the way a man looks when he wants to stay, but his body refuses to obey the will of his love. I could feel his hand trying to squeeze mine, failing, trembling, and then loosening. That was when I screamed his name, not as a wife, but as a drowning soul clinging to its last piece of shore. The daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway, then not running, not shaken, just watching, frozen not in sorrow but in calculation. Behind her, my son stood with a stunned, uncertain expression, as though he had never considered his father as more than a wall between him and opportunity. There was no rush toward him, no urgency, no grief, only a slow, creeping acknowledgement that their starting line had just been drawn. I yelled for an ambulance, my voice cracking through the hallway, but they didn't move until I commanded, not pleaded. I was still kneeling beside him, holding his body against mine, praying he would fight through this moment the way he had fought through every storm in life. His head rested weakly against my shoulder, his breaths fading like slow dissolving whispers. I kept whispering his name, shaking, begging, bargaining with God in fragments in desperation. Time became distorted after that. Minutes and seconds no longer existed, only the sound of my own pulse, roaring in my ears, and the coldness of his body creeping beneath my fingers. I felt helpless in a way I had never experienced in my life. I had seen sickness before, I had seen weakness before, but I had never seen love leaving the body it once lived in. The ambulance took too long, or maybe death works faster than any machine built by men. When the paramedics finally took him from my arms, I followed like someone walking after their soul instead of their husband. The hospital lights were blinding, the smell of antiseptic harsh, the hallway cold. I stood there shaking, praying, pleading under my breath like a woman who would trade every remaining day of her life for just one more hour with him. But there are doors in hospitals that close softly and still sound like the end of everything. When the doctor emerged, I already knew. His face told me before his words did. I didn't collapse, I dissolved. There was no scream, no dramatic fall, just a slow breaking from the inside, like a building whose foundation had been stolen without its walls noticing. I walked back through the hospital corridors with a numbness I cannot describe, half a woman, half a widow, entirely unanchored. But when we returned home, I realized the world outside that hospital had already been waiting for this moment. Before I could even sit, before I could even touch the chair he had last breathed in, the daughter-in-law spoke her first real sentence of the night. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "Are you all right," not even, "He's gone." She looked straight at me and said, "The keys. We need the keys." That was the moment I understood. I had not just lost my husband. I had just entered the battlefield he had been afraid to name. The house did not feel like a home when I returned from the hospital. It felt like a place that had already erased him. The moment his heartbeat stopped, I walked inside as though I were entering a stranger's walls, carrying a grief too heavy for my own legs. My hands shaking so badly I had to hold the side of the door to steady myself. I hadn't even taken off my shoes, hadn't removed the hospital tag from my wrist, and hadn't breathed properly since the doctor said the word was gone. The echo of it was still clinging to me like cold air. I thought I would have a moment, just one moment, to sit in silence and let my heart understand what my ears had heard. But silence did not belong to me anymore. The daughter-in-law appeared before I could even lower myself into a chair. She walked toward me, not as if she saw a widow, but as if she saw a transaction standing in her way. Her voice was soft, laced in a painfully fake tenderness. "You should rest," she said gently, with a tone that almost sounded like Karen Till. The next sentence followed without breath. "But before that, I need the keys, so I can start handling things." There it was, not even a pretense of mourning, just a thin veil of sweetness covering hunger. I felt my stomach twist. I couldn't speak, not because I agreed, because my grief hadn't yet found the space to become words. My ears were still ringing with the sound of his last broken breaths, and here she was, already building her kingdom on top of his ashes. She stepped closer, matching her tone to a sympathy she did not feel. "You've been through a lot. Let us take the burden now." Burden, that was the word she used to describe everything he had built for our family. Not legacy, not responsibility, but she did not want to protect his life's work. She wanted to inherit it while I was still wiping tears from my face. I tried to take a breath, but grief burns the lungs when someone tries to steal from the space where love just died. My voice did not come out. My hands trembled in my lap. I didn't trust myself to speak, not because I was weak, but because I knew if I opened my mouth at that moment, I might shatter. She misread my silence as surrender. She leaned forward, softening her face into rehearsed concern. "It's okay. I'm here now. I'll manage everything. Just give me the keys so I can secure the safe and the study." Secure, another word twisted into theft. She did not want to secure anything. She wanted to claim it before I had the chance to breathe. My son entered, then slowly, uncertainly, but he did not come to me. He did not hold me. He did not comfort me. He stood beside her, as though grief was an inconvenience that could wait until after paperwork. "Mom," he said quietly, "we just need access. Dad would want everything organized. There are heartbreaks a woman expects in life, even prepares for. Widowhood, loneliness, the silence of a house that once contained laughter. But there is a different kind of heartbreak. The one where your child stands on the opposite side of your suffering. The one where you realize love does not guarantee loyalty." I swallowed hard, still unable to form words. My hands were clenched tightly, not in anger, but in the desperate effort to hold myself together long enough not to fall apart in front of them. My body was shaking with grief, yet they mistook the trembling for hesitation, and hesitation for weakness. She sat beside me without asking permission, as though the chair belonged to her already. She reached for my hand, not out of care, but possession, and said, "Please don't worry. I'll take control of everything now. You just rest. You're not in a condition to handle finances. Not in a condition. Widow today, irrelevant tomorrow." That was how quickly my status had changed in her eyes. I looked toward the hallway where he used to stand when he came home in the evenings, unbuttoning his sleeves, smiling softly at me before speaking a word. That space was empty now, painfully empty, and yet they were already filling the emptiness with takeover plans. I still didn't answer. My silence wasn't consented, was mourning. But to people who don't understand love, silence is just an opportunity. She pressed again, her voice tightening beneath its softness. "Just pass me the keys so I can keep everything safe. You know, it's better handled quickly." quickly. She needed his body to cool before she could place her hands on what wasn't hers. I felt tears spill, not loud, not dramatic, just silent, helpless, overflow. And instead of stopping, instead of stepping back, she interpreted that moment of devastation as closure. "Good," she whispered, nodding to herself. "So you agree." Then she looked at my son. "She understands." Understand? No. I was breaking. They were harvesting. And somewhere, in the deepest part of me, I felt a whisper, faint but alive. This is why he was afraid. She stood up from the chair slowly, as if she had just secured a victory, then turned slightly toward my son with a small nod, like they had rehearsed this moment long before the grief had even reached our doorstep. I watched her walk toward his study with a confidence that did not belong to someone mourning, but to someone who believed the throne had just been vacated for her. And my son, the boy I once held against my heart when he had nightmares, followed behind her like a loyal extension of her will, not of his father's blood, her ambition. I rose to my feet, not to stop them. Not yet. Tyone took a step forward because I could not breathe sitting down. My hand found the wall for balance. As the world blurred through tears I still hadn't finished shedding, the house lights felt too bright, too intrusive, too present, as though they were exposing everything I wasn't ready to face yet. My husband's smell still lingered in the fabric of his chair. His voice still echoed in the corners of the room, and yet life, if this could still be called life, was already rearranging itself without him. They didn't even look back to see if I was all right. They didn't ask if I needed water, or to lie down, or simply to grieve. They didn't pause for dignity, because grief, when it belongs to someone else, is not an obstacle. It is a window of advantage. I heard drawers opening, the soft scrape of wood against wood, then the faint clink of metal keys being searched for. Every sound pierced deeper than the doctor's words had. A stranger can announce death, but only family can desecrate it. When they returned to the sitting area, they didn't slow their tone or soften it further. The daughter-in-law clasped her hands together lightly, performing sympathy with the tone of a woman who believed she had already moved to chapter 2 of her plans. "We'll need the safe key as well," she said, gentler than honey and sharper than glass. "You shouldn't trouble yourself with these matters now." My fingers tightened around the edge of the armrest. I still could not respond. My mouth felt full of stones, heavy, impossible to move, while my heart pounded with a rhythm that sounded like breaking. She took a few more steps forward, hovering too close, shadowing me like a figure claiming space that didn't belong to her. "If you just tell us where it is, we'll take care of everything before things get complicated." That word again, complicated. She did not fear disorder, she feared delay. My son finally spoke again, softer than her, but no less distant. "Mom, it's better if we manage all this now. You're not strong enough." Not strong enough. A sentence meant to sound protective, used as a tool of removal. I looked at him through blurred eyes, searching his face for even a trace of the boy I raised, the one who once ran to me when hurt, who once sought my arms as safety. But I didn't find him. I found a man who had already stepped into a role I hadn't known he was capable of choosing. Silent accomplice. The daughter-in-law reached toward my wrist then, as if she might guide me gently, but her grip held the undertone of possession. "Come," she murmured. "Just give me the access. After tomorrow's ritual, there will be paperwork to begin." After tomorrow, she had already scheduled her conquest. Something hollow opened up inside my chest. A widow should grieve, but I was not allowed to be a widow. I was being turned into a bystander in my own life, pushed aside before I could even hold the absence in my arms long enough to accept it. I moved my hand slowly out of hers, not forcefully, not in defiance, just because my grief could not tolerate her touch. She mistook the withdrawal for tiredness. Or, perhaps she didn't care, perhaps she only cared that my hand wasn't holding keys. She inhaled softly and turned back to my son. "She's overwhelmed. You take them from the bedroom aisle, handle the study." They weren't asking anymore. They were proceeding. And in that moment, even through the fog of heartbreak, I understood something with painful clarity. They didn't believe they were taking something from me. They believed it already belonged to them. My chest tightened with a pressure so sharp I had to hold my breath to keep from collapsing under it. I felt my knees soften beneath me, but I steadied myself against the chair, because there was no one left to hold me upright. The room felt smaller, the air thinner, and in that suffocating space I realized that grief was no longer my only enemy. Before I had even buried my husband, I was already being buried beside him, just not on the ground, in relevance. And somewhere far beneath the shock, beneath the trembling and the hollow ache, a different kind of silence began forming, not helplessness, the beginning of memory. A wife who had just lost her husband, and a woman who had just met her war. She was folding her late husband's sweater, the one he always wore on winter evenings, when she first heard it. Their voices drifted from down the hall, low at first, then careless, because they assumed she was too old, too slow, too absent to hear anything anymore. She's still here. What is she waiting for? A miracle. The daughter-in-law scoffed. A second voice, her own son, answered with a tired sigh. Just give it time. She eventually fade out. Fade out. Not heal, not settle, not find peace. Just fade out like something temporary. Like an old photograph left in the sun until color disappears. She felt the words land like tiny, cold needles pressing under her ribs. Not shouted, not violent, worse, indifferent. She stayed perfectly still, her hands resting on the folded wool, her breath caught halfway to her lungs. If they had screamed at her, she might have defended herself. If they had confronted her, she might have answered. But they erased her gently, carelessly, like she was a shadow. They were waiting to dissolve. For the first time since his death, the heavy silence around her didn't feel like grief alone. It felt like a warning. A realization crept in slowly, painfully. I am not losing them. They already decided I am gone. Her heart throbbed with something new. Not anger yet. Not courage, not strength, but awareness. A door opened inside her mind she didn't know existed. She had been surviving on memory, leaning on love that once existed. But love wasn't what filled this house anymore. She was living inside a place where her name was being written in disappearing ink. She did not cry. Tears would have given them power. She inhaled deeply, set the sweater aside, and looked at the faint reflection of herself in the window glass. Frail shoulders, tired eyes, yes, but eyes that still saw, eyes that still knew, eyes that still remembered who she had once been before grief made her small. She whispered under her breath, not a prayer, not a vow, not a vow, just a truth she had almost forgotten. I am still here. Not loudly, not definitely, quietly like an ember flickering back to life after nearly turning cold. Something shifted inside her spine, a small straightening, a barely visible reclaiming of herself. She understood suddenly that disappearing wasn't something that happens to you. It is something people count on you to let happen. And she wouldn't, not anymore. She rose slowly from the chair. For the first time, she walked through the hallway not like a ghost slipping through space, but like someone awake inside a world that had tried to put her to sleep. She passed by their voices, and for a moment, she looked toward them, not to speak, not to confront, just to see them clearly. She saw entitlement, she saw the calculation, and she saw something sharper underneath. They were not waiting for her to heal. They were waiting for her to be gone. That was the moment the ember turned into a spark. Unexpectedly, quiet, but alive, she returned to her room, not defeated this time but thinking. For the first time since her husband's death, she closed the door behind her, not in sorrow, but in privacy, protection, preparation. The silence no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a room where something was beginning, forming, gathering strength. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed her hand over her chest, feeling her pulse, not weak, not fading, steady, present, fade out. She whispered again, this time not wounded, but reflective, like she was tasting the words before deciding whether to spit them out or weaponize them. No, she would not fade. Not for them, not for convenience, not for inheritance, not for erasure. They had mistaken grief for surrender. And that was their first mistake. The next few days passed like a thick fog rolling through the house, where silence held its weight and the air felt heavy with things left unsaid. The daughter-in-law's eyes never strayed too far from the safe. The keys, the drawers that were being opened with the kind of confidence only someone who had already made up her mind could have. She no longer spoke to me with any pretense of kindness. Her words were curt, transactional, a list of things that needed to be done. And when they would be done, I watched her, not with fear, but with quiet understanding. She wasn't interested in my well-being. She wasn't trying to ease my pain. No, she was waiting. She was waiting for the day when everything would fall neatly into her hands, as she expected it to. And my son, he followed her, not because he truly believed in what was happening, but because he had already made a choice. It wasn't about us anymore, it was about them. Together, they stood on the precipice, eyes wide open to the riches that awaited them on the other side. They thought I couldn't see it, thought I couldn't feel it. But I could. I knew exactly what they were doing. But I also knew this. They did not understand the strength it took for me to be where I was. They did not understand the fire that had been buried beneath all these years of caring for them, of loving them, of being the silent strength that kept everything together. They thought that silence meant weakness. They were wrong. One evening, after the last of the funeral guests had left, I stood at the window overlooking the garden where we had once spent our evenings together. The roses he had planted still bloomed bright and unyielding, just as he had been in life. A thought crossed my mind, almost too quietly for me to hear. What am I waiting for? I had been waiting for something that would never come. I had been waiting for them to stop treating me like a shadow, but they never would. They had already chosen their path. They had already chosen what I meant to them. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about family. It was about power, and how quickly they could take it from me. But that was their mistake. They underestimated me. I turned away from the window and went to the study, the room where my husband had spent so many years working. I had not stepped in here since his passing. It felt wrong, like trespassing in a place where grief had not yet settled. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, there was no fear in me. There was only clarity. I walked over to his desk, where the papers were still scattered as he had left them. His handwriting was still there, his thoughts still alive in the ink, even though his body was gone. I picked up the first folder I saw, glancing through the documents as my fingers brushed over the pages. Every word he had written, every signature, was now a piece of history. His history, our history, and no one, not his daughter-in-law, not even my son, would erase it so easily. They had already made their move, but they had no idea what was coming. I sat down at his desk and took a deep breath, my hand hovering over the papers. It wasn't time yet, but I could feel the weight of the choice resting in my hands. I could feel the change beginning, quiet, steady, but undeniably there, and I would not be the one to let it slip through my fingers. In the days that followed, I started to gather the things I would need, quietly, carefully. I didn't rush. I didn't make any overt moves. The house was full of whispers, full of assumptions that I was fading, but what they didn't know was that I was quietly building something of my own. Every conversation with the daughter, every time she came into the room with a list of things for me to do or a question about the finances, I let her talk. I listened. I said very little, but inside, the fire was growing. It wasn't an angry fire, not yet. It was a slow, burning resolve. I would not let them have what was mine. One morning, I came downstairs to find my son in the study, sitting at my husband's desk, going through the papers. He hadn't noticed me yet, and for a moment, I watched him, feeling the weight of all the years I had spent raising him, of all the moments I had believed in his goodness. But, as I looked at him then, I realized I was looking at a stranger. The man who once ran to me for comfort had become the man who now sat with a woman who saw me only as a shadow to be removed. "Mom," he said, glancing up, "I'm just making sure everything is in order. You know, for the will." I nodded quietly, my eyes cold, but my voice steady. "I understand." I could feel the tension in the air, a quiet understanding between us that neither of us would acknowledge. I stood there for a long moment, staring at him, remembering the boy he once was, the boy who had looked up to his father as a role model, the boy who had trusted me to protect him. But he had chosen his path now, and I had chosen mine. As I turned to leave, I knew the moment was approaching, the moment when everything would change. They would no longer believe they could walk all over me. They would soon realize that the woman they thought was broken was the one who still held the keys to everything they sought. They would learn that erasing me was not as easy as they thought. But for now, I waited. I watched, and I prepared. It's strange how the world changes around you when you stop waiting for it to. How when you stop hoping that things will get better on their own, you realize that the strength you've been searching for was always there, buried beneath the rubble of other people's expectations. The days blurred into each other, one long stretch of waiting, watching, and preparing. But now, it wasn't just waiting. I wasn't sitting in the shadows anymore. I wasn't a passive observer, a grieving widow hoping for mercy. I was learning how to move in a world that had forgotten how to see me. It began with small things. At first, I started taking back the parts of this house that had always been mine. The family pictures that had once adorned the walls were replaced with papers, official notices, and legal jargon. The spaces between the rooms became wider, colder, like a house that was starting to forget the life that once lived within it. But I wasn't going to let that happen. It started with my husband's study. The daughter-in-law thought the study belonged to her now. She would go in, sit at his desk, and flip through the papers like she was the one who had spent years building the legacy he'd left behind. But I knew what she was looking for, and I wasn't about to make it easy for her. One evening, I walked into that room, where she was already sitting at his desk, her fingers trailing over his old leather chair, the keys to his safe in front of her. She didn't look up when I entered. It wasn't out of respect. It was because she didn't think she needed to. I waited for a moment, standing at the door, and then I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of years spent being silent. "Those keys don't belong to you." She froze, her fingers stilling on the cold metal of the safe. Then, slowly, she looked up, a smile playing on her lips. "What do you mean? You're not in any condition to manage things, Ma. We're just trying to make sure everything is in order." "No," I said, stepping further into the room, my feet soundless on the floor. "I've been in order for longer than you've been a part of this family, and it's time you understand that." She laughed, a thin, cutting sound. "You think you can stop us now? You're a widow. You're alone. You've already lost him. What more do you want?" I stepped closer, feeling the power of the moment surge through me. "I may have lost him," I said, each word deliberate, "but I haven't lost myself." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression hardening, but there was something there, something I hadn't expected, a flicker of uncertainty, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around herself. She stood up, slowly, as though she were deciding how to respond. "You're a fool if you think you have any say in this." I didn't flinch. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I was tired of being afraid of everyone and everything. I had spent too many years as an invisible woman in my own home, and I wasn't going to let her erase me like that. "I'm not asking for permission," I said, my voice low but steady. "I'm telling you, this house, this legacy, it's mine. And if you think you can take it from me while I'm still breathing, you're mistaken." The tension in the room thickened. For a brief second, I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been hidden behind her calculating smile. But she quickly masked it again, her eyes hardening. "You'll regret this. You'll see. You don't have the power to stop us." "Maybe," I replied, "but I'm not the one who needs to stop you." I turned and walked out of the study, leaving her standing there, her hands still hovering over the papers. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of my words, but it wasn't enough to break her confidence just yet. She thought she still had control. She thought she could still dictate the terms of my life, my family, my husband's legacy. But I knew something she didn't. I knew that the one thing she could never take from me, the one thing she could never erase, was my will to fight back. That night, sleep did not visit me, not because I was afraid, but because, for the first time in weeks, my mind was awake. My thoughts were clear, sharp, like glass that had finally been cleaned after being fogged over by grief. I watched the house in silence, not as a prisoner, but as someone taking inventory of what had been stolen slowly, inch by inch. Dignity, respect, presence. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, careful, secretive. I recognized them instantly. I didn't move. I kept my breathing steady, pretending to sleep, while my ears traced her movements like a hunter listening for a pattern. She wasn't going to the kitchen. She wasn't going to her room. She was heading back to the study. The safe. I waited until the click of the door faded. Then I slowly sat up and reached for my shawl. The house was dimly lit, only the faint glow of the hallway lamp guiding me. But I didn't need light. I knew every inch of this home. I walked like someone returning to a battlefield she once built with her own hands. When I reached the study door, I didn't enter. I didn't need to. The door was slightly open, and I could see her hunched over the desk, rifling through documents, opening drawers, her hands frantic but greedy, like she feared the treasure might evaporate if she didn't grab it fast enough. I stood there quietly, watching her. This was not a woman caring for a grieving elder. This was a woman bearing her true appetite in the dark, a scavenger waiting for death to finalize the paperwork. She didn't notice me at first. She was too busy reading through the assets ledger, flipping pages faster and faster. And in that moment, I realized something. She had no idea what she was looking for. No understanding, no history. Asterisk, no lineage, no meaning. She wanted numbers, not legacy. I pushed the door gently, letting it make a sound against the hinge. She snapped her head up, startled, panic flashing in her eyes before she forced her voice to cool. "Oh, you're awake. I never sleep deeply. I replied. Not anymore. She swallowed, pretending composure. I was just organizing things, making sure everything will be transitioned properly. You shouldn't strain yourself with all of this. I stepped into the room, slow but deliberate. My footsteps neither rushed nor hesitant, just steady. You aren't organizing, I said quietly. You're positioning. There's a difference. Her expression hardened. You think I don't know what I'm doing? No, I said, meeting her eyes. I think you don't know who you're dealing with. She scoffed, standing up and crossing her arms. What exactly do you think you can do at this age? You don't have anyone. You don't have allies. You don't even have the strength to. I cut her off with a calmness she didn't expect. I don't need allies, I said. I am the legacy. She blinked. For a second, the mask slipped, not into guilt, but into caution. The first time she realized I wasn't going to crumble. You talk like you still have power, she said coldly. But you don't. Everything is moving forward with or without your permission. And yet, I answered softly, you're still sneaking around in the dark. That hit her. Her silence gave her away. If she was so confident, she would do it in daylight. If she was so certain, she wouldn't hide. Guiltless people do not lower their voices in their own homes. She looked like she wanted to argue, wanted to spit back something sharp, but she didn't. Instead, she closed the ledger too quickly, like a thief shutting a drawer when footsteps echo in a hallway. Go back to bed, she snapped. You need rest. No, I replied. What I need is clarity. And tonight, I got it. I turned to leave, and I could feel her staring at my back, not with amusement this time, not with dismissal, but with the first whisper of unease, because she finally understood. I was no longer grieving. I was preparing, and a woman who prepares is far more dangerous than a woman who cries. The morning after that midnight encounter, I woke before the sun, not because of habit, because of purpose. For weeks I had moved through this house like a shadow, breathing carefully so I would not disturb anyone. But this morning, the silence served me, not them. I opened my wardrobe and pulled out the small wooden box my husband had gifted me on our 20th anniversary, the one no one ever bothered to ask about, because they assumed it held sentimental trinkets or old jewelry I never wore. They never knew it held something more valuable than gold, legal proof of identity, ownership, and decisions he had entrusted to me long before his health began to fail. I sat at the edge of my bed, lifted the lid, and sifted through the documents: original trust papers, property agreements, records of accounts no one but he and I knew existed. I traced my fingers over his handwriting and heard his voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me. If anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone speak louder than you in your own home. For the first time since he left this world, I felt something stronger than loss alignment, as if he were still here, not protecting me as a shield, but reminding me I had always been a pillar. I gathered the documents and placed them in my handbag, not hidden, not locked away, transferred, because shadows are only useful until the light returns, and today, I would start turning on the lights. I dressed slowly and with purpose, not in something heavy and mourning, but in the deep navy shawl he always loved, the one he said made me look like I still own every room I walk into. They had taken my softness for weakness, so I would let them see my stillness as a strategy. I came downstairs just as my son and his wife were having breakfast. She barely looked at me. He gave me the same practiced, empty sympathy he'd been offering since the funeral, the kind used on strangers and formalities, not mothers. He said, "Mom, we're meeting the lawyer this week to finalize the estate division. There are a few documents missing, but once we find them, everything will be transferred smoothly." Transferred, I repeated gently. Yes, the daughter-in-law cut in, her tone clipped. "Before things get complicated." I met her eyes. "Oh," I said softly, "things won't be complicated, not for me." She tilted her head, her smile tightening. She heard the tone, but she couldn't yet read it. My son wiped his hands, speaking with the false warmth of someone who had already decided I was no longer relevant. "It's just a formality, Mom. We'll make sure everything is handled." I nodded slowly. "Good," I said. "Then I'll make sure everything is handled." He blinked, confusion flickering through him, because I wasn't supposed to sound like a participant. I was supposed to sound like an afterthought. But I placed my purse on the table, intentionally, not quietly, and both their eyes fell on it for a fraction of a second. Something instinctive in them registered that I was holding something they didn't know about. "I'll be going out today," I said. The daughter-in-law frowned. "Where?" I turned to her, not cold, not warm, simply unreadable. To make sure I still exist on paper the same way I exist in this house. And for the first time since my husband's death, neither of them had a reply. Because they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know what he had prepared. And they didn't know that the woman they had mistaken for a silent widow was now a witness, not just to their cruelty, but to their miscalculation. I picked up my handbag and walked toward the door. I didn't hurry. I didn't look back. I just moved with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally remembered the power of her own name. And behind me, I felt it, not respect yet, not fear, just the first fracture of doubt in their confidence. The fight had not begun in the open yet, but the battlefield had already shifted. The car ride to the lawyer's office felt different this time. The last time I had walked through those doors, I was a grieving widow, surrounded by people who spoke over me, around me, through me. The way people speak to someone they've already decided is fading. Today, I walked in not as a victim of loss, but as the living continuation of the man whose legacy built everything they were, scrambling to control. The receptionist looked up, surprised to see me alone. "Ma'am, did you have an appointment?" "I don't need one," I answered calmly. "Tell Mr. Rowe that his client's wife is here." She nodded quickly. Grief had made me look fragile, but authority still traveled in my voice. Some things do not age. Some power doesn't need introduction, only remembrance. Within minutes, I was escorted to his office. Mr. Rowe stood when I entered. He had seen me before, sitting on the corner of the room, silent, drowned in black shawls and trembling fingers. Today, I placed my handbag on his desk. "Not my sorrow, madame," he said softly, "not out of pity, but out of respect. I was wondering when you would come." I sat down. "I came before they decided my future without me." He nodded slowly, his expression tightening with an understanding deeper than words. "I assumed as much," he said. "They've contacted me twice already, eagerly." "I know," I replied. "They're waiting for the day I become so quiet I'd disappear." He leaned forward. "And will you?" "No," I said. "I'm done disappearing." I opened the wooden box and placed the documents on the desk, one by one. The originals, not the softened photocopies they thought were the only versions. His eyebrows lifted in recognition. "These," he said gravely, "are not supposed to be in their hands. These were entrusted to you." "I know," I answered. "My husband did not trust accidental heirs. He trusted builders, he trusted loyalty, and he trusted history." He exhaled slowly. "Then, I believe this conversation needs to be private and formal." He reached across the table and locked the door. That small sound, the soft click of that lock, was the first tangible step of reclaiming my life. He took out another file, one I hadn't seen. "Your husband updated certain directives before his health declined," he said quietly. "He never told them. He kept these sealed until the day you chose to open this conversation yourself." I felt my breath still, not in fear, but in recognition. "He prepared for everything," I whispered. "He prepared for this." Mr. Rowe corrected gently. He slid the folder toward me. "These documents ensure that nothing, no transfer, no access, no claim, moves forward without your written consent, not by your son, not by your daughter-in-law, not by anyone." For a moment, I closed my eyes, not to cry, to steady myself, to reclaim every piece of myself that grief had numbed, to feel my spine align with his legacy again. When I opened them, my voice carried a strength that had been missing from me for far too long. "Then, it's time," I said. Mr. Rowe nodded. "I will update the security protocols, freeze interim access to key assets, and notify the registrar. Nothing moves now unless you move it." And for the first time since I buried my husband, I felt something I thought I had lost with him: sovereignty. I was not a widow being managed. I was a matriarch reclaiming her seat. I gathered the documents back into my bag, and as I stood to leave, Mr. Rowe said quietly, "When they realize the control is not theirs, they will come for you." "I know," I replied, "and when they do, I will be ready." I walked out of that office taller than I had walked in, not physically, spiritually. They thought they had already written the ending of my story. They thought I was a silent obstacle standing in the way of their victory, but they forgot something fundamental. I was the reason there is even a victory to claim, and I had just taken the first piece of it back, that evening. I returned home before anyone else. The house felt different to me now, not empty, but reclaimed, like a kingdom restored to the ruler who had been quietly pushed off the throne. I didn't wait for servants to open doors. or for voices to acknowledge me. I walked straight to my husband's study, the one they had slowly begun treating as a storage room, hoping to suffocate his memory and mine along with it. I turned the key. The door opened, and with it, so did history. The air carried the faint scent of his cologne trapped in old papers. His chair still angled slightly the way he used to sit when he leaned back thinking. They hadn't stepped in here with respect. They stepped in only when they needed something. But not anymore. I closed the door behind me and locked it. This room was no longer abandoned. This room was active again. I sat in his chair, not for sentiment, but for position. A king's legacy does not survive by accident. It survives through whoever has the strength to wield it. And today, I had that strength. A while later, I heard the front gate open, then hurried footsteps, then voices, irritated, nervous, whispering to one another. They had already found out. They must have spoken to someone at the registrar's office, or the bank. Either way, the ground had shifted. Someone knocked sharply on the study door. "Mother, are you inside?" My son, not sounding concerned, sounded inconvenienced. I didn't reply immediately. Silence is not weakness. Silence is power when you choose it. Another knock, louder this time. "Why is this room locked?" "Open the door." I finally spoke, not with anger, but with something far harder to fight. Authority. Double quotes. "This room was never yours to open," I said, voice calm, not raised. "You entered it only because I allowed it. That permission has now been withdrawn." I could feel the tension even through the door. He wasn't expecting resistance. They never do until it's too late. The daughter-in-law's voice joined his, sharp and irritated. "What is going on?" "The bank called. The transfer is on hold. They're asking for her signature again. They said nothing can move forward without her approval now." The outrage in her voice would have once shaken me. Now it only confirmed one thing. I had just stepped back into ownership. I opened the door slowly, not fully, just enough to look at them, and said, "Correct, because it cannot, and it never could without me." Their faces, stunned, unsure, scrambling for words, told me everything. For the first time since my husband died, they were the ones standing outside the door. Not me. My son tried softening his tone, the forced politeness people use when power has slipped from their hands. "Mother, you don't understand how many things are pending. We were just trying to handle." "I know exactly what you were trying to handle." I cut in gently, "and you did until today. Now it returns to its rightful supervision." His wife folded her arms, unable to hide her irritation. "We're family. Why are you suddenly behaving like everything must go through you?" I held her gaze, not cruelly, but meaningfully, because it does. No shouting, no tears, no trembling hands, just truth spoken by the only one who actually had the right to speak it. I didn't wait for them to respond. I closed the door again, slowly, deliberately, and locked it from the inside. This was no longer the house where I was being managed. This was the house where order had been restored. A quiet empire had just changed hands. The air in the house had changed. Even before the first words were spoken, it was thick with tension, an unspoken warning that the balance of power had shifted. For weeks, they had believed they were untouchable, that my grief would keep me silent, invisible, manageable. But now, every glance, every movement, every breath carried the knowledge that I had returned. The daughter-in-law's voice carried sharpness as soon as she saw me in the dining room. "You're back early," she said, trying to mask irritation with casualness. But it failed. Her shoulders were tight, her fingers twitching, the kind of small, betrayed signals people give when their control is slipping. I didn't answer immediately. I simply placed my handbag on the table, keeping my eyes on her, not with threat, but with calm clarity. Silence is heavier than words when it carries truth. My son, sitting opposite her, shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I said gently, holding up a hand. "I don't need excuses. I don't need explanations. And I certainly don't need permission to exist in my own home." Her lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. Instead, she leaned back slightly, assessing me like a predator realizing its prey had teeth. I finally spoke. "You've been making decisions without me, accessing accounts, signing papers, moving things I didn't approve of. Everything you've done, you did because you assumed I would not act. But assumptions are dangerous." A cold silence fell. Even the servants, who had witnessed the quiet war from the sidelines, felt it. They paused, unsure whether to intervene. The daughter-in-law tried to regain her composure. "Mom, don't exaggerate. We were just helping, organizing the estate. You've been delicate. We're trying to protect you from stress. I smiled faintly, not warmly, not cruelly, but with the weight of absolute knowledge. Protect me? No. You were protecting yourselves, and now you will learn what it means when a mother decides to act for herself. Her face hardened. And what do you plan to do? She asked, almost daring me to answer. I took a small step forward, placing my hands on the edge of the table. I have already acted. Legal control is restored in my name. Nothing moves without me. Every asset, every account, every document under my supervision. And before you ask, yes, this includes everything you thought you could claim by stealth. A flicker of panic crossed her eyes, tiny, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My son opened his mouth, but I held up a finger. Don't speak. You've already revealed enough through your actions. She shifted, standing up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You can't do this. You don't understand the complexity. Everything is in motion. I didn't allow her to finish. Everything is in motion, because you moved it without permission. That is exactly why it stops here. And the next steps are mine, not yours. The room felt like it had contracted walls closer, the chandelier's light sharper, every breath louder. The daughter-in-law's hands shook slightly as she tried to mask her fury, while my son's jaw tightened, the same instinctive tension he had carried when he was forced to choose sides in the past. I took a seat deliberately, in my husband's place at the head of the table, not out of ego, not out of theatrics, but out of position. Authority is not claimed through yelling. Authority is claimed through presence. You two have been operating under the illusion that grief made me weak, I said softly. You were wrong. And now, every move you make will be visible. Every decision you think you can make alone will be accounted for. Everything will pass through me first. Her face turned pale. This isn't how it works, she said, voice trembling for the first time. You don't have the I do, I interrupted, because you underestimated me, because you assumed absence equals weakness, and because you forgot one simple truth. This house, this family, this legacy, it belongs to the one who built it and the one who preserves it. And that is me. She swallowed, her throat working as she tried to find a comeback. There wasn't one. Not yet. That my son, finally speaking, said quietly, Mom, I didn't realize. I mean, you didn't realize. I asked, calm, but with a sharp edge. You should have realized the day you followed her orders instead of mine. The day you allowed her to speak louder than my voice. The day you assumed my grief would erase me. That was the day you were already late. The daughter-in-law's hands clenched into fists. This isn't over, she spat, voice shaking. We will find a way around you. I leaned forward, eyes steady, voice low and deliberate. Then try, but remember this. The woman you thought would fade quietly is no longer hiding. Every move you make in secret, every attempt to override me, every corner you think you can cut, I will know, and I will stop it. Not out of anger, out of principle. For the first time, both of them understood this was no longer a whisper war behind doors. This was the battlefield laid bare. And the tide had already turned. The next morning, the house was tense in a way that made the walls feel smaller, the air heavier. I could hear her whispering with my son near the study, pacing, plotting. They believed that control was still in their hands, that the law and logic could be bent around a grieving widow. They were wrong. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, carrying nothing but the confidence that had been quietly growing inside me for weeks. Every step I took was a statement, even if unspoken. Every glance I gave them carried the weight of the truth. I was no longer passive, no longer the invisible obstacle they had assumed I would remain. The daughter-in-law approached me in the living room, her tone sharpened by desperation. Mom, I think we need to discuss the estate immediately. Some documents require signatures, and if we delay, I cut her off with a calm smile that made her falter. We can discuss nothing that isn't under my oversight. She blinked. You can't just. I can, I interrupted, my voice steady, my posture firm, because I have the authority. Every account, every paper, every decision passes through me first. Not through whispers, not through fear, not through you. She stepped closer, trying to dominate space, trying to assert the same control she had taken for granted. You don't understand. You don't realize how much work has gone into this. I didn't flinch. Instead, I held her gaze and said softly, almost in a whisper, I understand exactly. That's why it ends here. Her confidence faltered. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed and her lips pressed together. She had believed she was untouchable, and now the ground beneath her was trembling for the first time. Determined, she tried again, sharper this time. If you block this, you're putting everything at risk. You'll lose control. You'll ruin your family. I shook my head slowly. The only thing I'll ruin is the illusion that you ever held power over me. The family is not yours to manage. It never was. And now, the moment you try to steal it quietly, the consequences begin. She stopped mid-step, her eyes widening. For the first time, fear edged into her carefully constructed bravado. I could see her calculating, wondering how I had regained so much so quickly. I leaned closer, calm, precise. I warned you, every attempt to bypass me will fail. Every secret will be exposed, and every move you make in anger will only strengthen my position. My son tried to intervene, voice trembling with uncertainty. Mom, maybe we can find a compromise. I raised a finger, gently but firmly, stopping him mid-sentence. No, there is no compromise when the rule of law and principle have been ignored. You can either respect it now, or you can experience the consequences of ignoring it. Your choice. The daughter-in-law's lips pressed into a thin line. She tried to mask it, tried to breathe calmly, but her eyes betrayed panic, the first real recognition that the game had changed. She had been playing with someone she assumed powerless, and now she faced the reality. She was up against a woman who had waited, observed, and planned quietly, unseen, while they had acted recklessly. For the first time, the daughter-in-law realized the truth she had never considered. I was no longer reacting. I was leading, and that difference alone was terrifying. I took a slow step back, giving her space, but not freedom. Consider this your first lesson. Do not test it again. Her hands twitched at her sides. She wanted to argue, to shout, to grab control, but something held her back. A small, deadly awareness had settled in. She was no longer the predator. She was now navigating my territory, and in that quiet room, the first real cracks appeared in her carefully constructed armor. Because now, for the first time, she understood. The woman she thought would fade quietly was the one holding all the cards, and the game had just begun. By late afternoon, the house had changed. The once confident daughter-in-law moved cautiously, her steps calculated, her voice clipped when speaking. Even my son, who had tried to remain neutral, now shifted uneasily. Whenever I entered a room, the quiet tremor of control had begun to settle, and it was no longer in their hands. I spent the day calmly reviewing documents, making phone calls, and quietly asserting authority over accounts and papers that had once been theirs to manipulate. Every action I took was deliberate, measured, and visible, not reckless, not angry, but unstoppable in its precision. When evening arrived, they both gathered in the living room, speaking in hushed tones. I could hear fragments. She has access now. We can't do anything without her. This wasn't supposed to happen. I walked in, carrying nothing, speaking nothing at first. I simply stood in the doorway, letting the silence stretch. The daughter-in-law's eyes darted to me, searching for a reaction I did not give. My son's jaw tightened. Finally, I spoke, calm and measured. I see the confusion. I understand why you assumed absence meant weakness. But weakness is not measured in silence. It is measured in surrender, and I have surrendered nothing. Her face paled. My son swallowed hard, unable to speak. For the first time, both of them felt the weight of my presence, not as a shadow, but as the rightful authority. I am not here to punish you, I continued. I am here to restore what belongs where it should have always been. Every decision, every action, every asset will be accounted for. From now on, nothing moves without my knowledge. This is not a threat, it is a fact. One that you will both have to live with. The daughter-in-law's hands trembled slightly. My son's gaze dropped. The room, once full of their confident scheming, now felt quiet and fragile, as if the walls themselves recognized the shift. And that was the moment the first true victory of this quiet war became clear. The invisible woman they had tried to erase was no longer invisible. The house had a new balance, and the scales of power had tipped. I left the room then, not in haste, but in deliberate calm, letting the weight of my authority settle in behind me. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to fight. I simply existed, fully, clearly, unmistakably. And in that existence, the first undeniable truth was set. The daughter-in-law was no longer the one in control. The battlefield had shifted, and the final act was waiting. The morning sunlight spilled across the living room, but the warmth couldn't reach the daughter. She moved like a caged animal, her carefully constructed confidence crumbling with every passing hour. The house was no longer hers to manipulate. Every document, every account, every decision she had once assumed she controlled now carried my name legally, officially, undeniably. I watched her from the hallway as she fumbled with her phone, calling the bank, muttering, trying to regain footing. Panic flickered in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with irritation. My son hovered nearby, unsure, caught between loyalty, fear, and the reality that the rules had changed. I stepped into the living room, carrying nothing but quiet authority. They both looked up, startled, as though they had forgotten I had ever been anything other than a shadow. "Good morning," I said softly. "I hope you're both ready to understand how things work from now on." The daughter-in-law opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "Save it. I've already heard all your justifications. I've already accounted for every document, every asset, every signature. And yes, I have already secured the accounts you thought you could touch without me." Her hands trembled. You can't do this. I already have," I interrupted gently, letting my words sink in. "Everything that you tried to claim in secrecy has been restored to its rightful oversight. Every transfer, every property, every account under my supervision. Nothing moves without my authorization." My son swallowed hard. "Mom, we didn't mean to, I repeated, voice calm but sharp. "You acted as though grief erased me. You acted as though absence meant silence. You acted as though love and loyalty could be bypassed. But love doesn't work that way. Loyalty doesn't work that way. And absence does not erase a person." The daughter-in-law's lips pressed together, but she could not find words. For the first time, she realized she was no longer leading. She was following rules she had never thought to respect. I walked slowly to the study, where my husband's documents rested in their rightful place, carefully filed, secured, accounted for. I picked up the folder containing the updated legal directives, letting them feel the weight of my authority without a single raised voice. "From today," I said, turning to face them both, "everything moves through me. And yes, I will consider your input, but make no mistake, the decisions will be mine to make, because I am the only one entrusted with this responsibility. Not because I demand it, but because I earned it." Her hands tightened into fists. "You think this will stop me?" she spat, trying to regain courage. I smiled faintly, calm and composed. "No, I don't need to stop you. You will stop yourself the moment you realize the house, the legacy, and the trust you tried to manipulate are not yours to command. Everything you attempted in secrecy is now fully visible. Every move you make is accounted for. And if you cross the line, there are consequences you will not enjoy." The daughter-in-law's jaw tightened, her arrogance crumbling. My son looked at her, unease creeping into his voice. "Maybe we overstepped," he murmured. "Yes," I said softly, but firmly. "You did, and the consequence is awareness. Awareness that I am not gone. Awareness that I am present. Awareness that the legacy you thought could be stolen is alive in my hands and I will protect it." They both looked at me, stunned, for the first time seeing me not as a widow, not as someone weakened by loss, but as a force of unwavering resolve. The daughter-in-law swallowed hard, realizing that every plan she had made, every corner she had tried to cut, every quiet advantage she thought she held, had been nullified before she even acted. I continued, my voice low but precise. "I did not wait for this confrontation to act out of anger. I waited to act out of clarity. I waited to act when every move, every document, every legal step was secured. You will learn that patience and preparation outweigh arrogance and speed." For a moment, there was silence. The air was heavy with recognition. The power had shifted entirely, not because I had shouted, not because I had threatened, but because I had acted. My son stepped forward, hesitant, as if seeking approval for something he had once assumed was his right to decide. "Mom, thank you," he whispered, almost inaudible. I nodded, not for gratitude, but for acknowledgement. "This is only the beginning. The legacy was never theirs to take, and now it is restored, fully, completely, indisputably. It will remain intact, not just for me, but for the future it was always meant to serve." The daughter-in-law sank into the chair, defeated, realizing the full extent of her miscalculation. She had tried to erase me, to move faster than I could react, to manipulate the estate and my son, but she had failed. She had underestimated patience, preparation, and the quiet but unbreakable strength of the woman she thought she could overpower. I walked past her, placing my hand on my husband's chair in the study, feeling the weight of history and legacy solidify beneath me. I turned to face them one last time. "This is your lesson," I said. "Power is not claimed by theft, by manipulation, or by arrogance. Power is held by those who endure, who prepare, and who act with purpose. And now you understand who holds it here." The daughter-in-law said nothing. My son lowered his gaze. The house, once a stage for their silent schemes, was now mine again, not by chance, not by accident, but by strategy, by resolve, and by the unshakable truth that absence does not erase a person, and grief does not weaken resolve. I exhaled softly, finally letting the tension leave my shoulders. The fight had been quiet, deliberate, and invisible until now, but it was over. The legacy was restored, the family hierarchy had been realigned, and I had reclaimed not just what was mine, but my rightful place in the world my husband had trusted me to protect. The daughter-in-law would adapt or falter. My son had been reminded of the difference between presence and pretense, and I, finally, could breathe, knowing that the power, the authority, and the legacy that had been nearly stolen were now secure, fully, absolutely, undeniably. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace. Not the fragile peace of grief, but the deep, unshakable peace of a woman who had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her family. The war had ended, the legacy was mine, and I had emerged stronger than ever. Have you ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or erased by someone you trusted? Tell me your story in the comments. I want to hear how you found your strength. And if you believe in standing up for yourself no matter the odds, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Grandma's Moments, and turn on the common notifications so you never miss a story of courage and legacy.